Alrighty. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I think we'll get started here. We might have a couple people filter in over the next couple minutes, but I think looks like it's slowing down a little bit. So, my name is Michael Mativa. I'm the SORA Vice Chair, and I'll be kind of emceeing our event today. I think how this is going to work, we'll have two presenters. Michaela Miller is going to talk first about her work analyzing tax incentives without ROI, and then we'll have Dr. Jeff Allen speak about a couple different projects that he's done in the vein of interactive maps and urban storytelling. So both of those should take roughly 15 to 20 minutes each, and then I think we're going to reserve about 10 minutes for questions. The way this will work, if you have a question at the end, please use the hand raising function, and I'll elevate you to a presenter, and you should be able to turn on your microphone and ask your question, any follow-ups you might have. But yeah, we'll try and keep it moving. So without further ado, we'll get Michaela Miller going here. So like I said, our first speaker is Michaela Miller, a revenue analyst for Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office. The IFO provides revenue projections as well as impartial analysis of fiscal, economic, and budgetary issues to assist in policy decisions. This includes assessing the effects of tax incentives, and she's here today to talk about her work with the Resource Enhancement and Protection, or REAP, tax credit. So thanks, Michaela, for coming and speaking with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Certainly. I'm going to quickly share my screen here and just confirm that you're able to see the presentation.
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right. Well, as you mentioned, yes, my name is Michaela Miller, and I'm an analyst at the Pennsylvania Independent Fiscal Office, and it's very wonderful to be with you all here today. It is 2 p.m. here in Pennsylvania, so it's a bit of a time difference, but it's understandable. It's all good. Anyway, I'm here to talk today about the some of our tax credit work that we do at our office, and specifically ones where broad economic impact is not necessarily part of the incentive itself, and what you can do to or how I guess we analyze those tax credits. And so just to give you a brief bit of background on our office, as I mentioned, I'm with the Pennsylvania Independent Fiscal Office, or IFO for short. And we're an office that was created back in 2010. So we're a fairly new agency, I would say, in the realm of how long state agencies can sometimes be in existence. We're a legislative agency, but we are independent. We're actually modeled off of the Federal Congressional Budget Office, or just at the state level. So most other states do have a fiscal office, but they're housed kind of within the state legislature, and Pennsylvania is unique in that ours is outside of the legislature, our own independent thing. Almost all other fiscal offices have a governing board composed of legislators. We just have our director who is appointed, and then he sort of delegates all their operations from there. Most other fiscal offices are also bipartisan. We are nonpartisan. And our various responsibilities span a wide range of issues. But today I wanted to sort of go over what our tax credit reviews. And that actually kind of came about in 2017 with this thing called Act 48. So Act 48 of 2017 is known as the Performance-Based Budgeting and Tax Credit Efficiency Act. And this act requires our office to review all Pennsylvania state tax credits on a 5-year rolling basis. And so every year we have a select number of tax credits where we're expected to review and do reports on. And the main subject of these reviews is to answer this question up here, which is, did the tax credits accomplish their legislative intent? And so we spend the whole year working on these reviews, and we submit them to a legislative board, the Performance-Based Budgeting Board. And the board will then have a hearing on our reports, and the legislators who are part of that board will approve or vote to approve our reports. They're not approving of our findings, just more whether we've done our due diligence and looked at all the potential areas of research in the credits. The administering agency that runs the credit also needs to attend in order to answer any questions that the legislators might have. So all these reports I'm going to talk about today or mention are available on our website. So if you have any interest, just feel free to go check them out. But the key points of these reports, we have to establish goals and purposes for them. Sometimes this is in statute, and that makes it a little easy. Other times it's a little unclear, and we have to do some research to figure out what the goal and the purpose of the credit is. And that's mainly to answer this top part, which is if we don't know what the goal is, how can we measure it? So this other part, we need to include a state comparison of similar programs in other states. Sometimes this section is quite lengthy. A lot of other states, for example, have a research and development tax credit, and so that was a very long section in that report. But other times, Pennsylvania just has a very unique tax credit program, and so this is a little bit smaller. This is a bit, this portion with the recommendations is a bit different for us. We don't, being a nonpartisan independent agencies, we don't make any sort of policy recommendations, but Act 48 does actually require us to, in this case for the tax credit reviews. And that's been a bit of a challenge because when we're going through these reviews, we know we have to make those recommendations. And so we need to be able to have some points or research to back up those recommendations. And then finally, calculate a return on investment metric, only if it's applicable. Well, we're going to talk today about ones where it's not applicable. And some examples of those might be the following. So you're not going to have like some tax credits, and you might have some in your mind that are going to be motivating economic growth. They're not necessarily designed to grow an industry or expand the economy. So one example of that could be charitable contributions tax credits. We have a tax credit here in Pennsylvania called the Neighborhood Assistance Program, and that's where a business entity can donate to a nonprofit project, and they can get a tax credit for that donation. And there, the goal isn't to cause this big economic boom in the state. It's just that the state wants to encourage corporate social responsibility and improve the communities where these businesses are located. And so that's not really something that is going to massively expand the economy. Another category could be environmental protection. We're going to talk about one of these today, so I'm not going to get too into detail, but an example of that might be a tax credit where you're installing solar panels on your house and you can get a tax credit for the installation. And there, the state feels it's a laudable goal to have people have solar panels on their house. And so they're going to give people a tax credit for that to encourage that behavior. Another example is public health. We looked at the organ and bone marrow donation tax credit, and this was a tax credit. It was a bit interesting. It was a tax credit for an employer or a business that would provide paid sick leave for an employee who was a living donor for organ or bone marrow. And so this was a way to sort of help people that desire to donate an organ or bone marrow to receive paid time off. And so it was an interesting tax credit, but generally the goal of that is not to grow the economy. It's just to make it easier for people that desire to do this life-saving duty and make it a little bit easier on them. So as you can imagine, going through these examples, evaluating these programs presents some unique challenges. For one, calculating the return on investment metric for these programs does not necessarily indicate whether it's accomplishing its legislative intent. That is to say, the ROI is an inappropriate way to measure these programs. And also, when we've looked at the data for these tax credit programs, the quantitative sort of outcome data is often lacking. And that's partially two reasons. One is a lot of times agencies, when they're collecting data, they're kind of say, okay, here's the applicants, here's how much money was exchanged in tax credits. And so they're kind of looking at it as a dollars and cents transaction. The other issue is a lot of these outcomes, especially for these sorts of credits, are just not very measurable. For example, if you're doing a historic preservation tax credit and you've improved the look of the building, how do you measure the happiness of people now looking at that very nice building? So this presents a lot of challenges. And so I wanted to walk through an example of one, and I did mention it's a environmental protection tax credit. This is the Resource Enhancement and Protection Tax Credit, also known as REAP. And it is a credit that is designed to incentivize the installation or implementation of what are known as agricultural best management practices, or BMPs. And these can be a variety of different things, but generally all of them are designed to reduce runoff pollution from agriculture. So it might be a building that has a system where it collects animal waste and prevents animal waste from getting into the water system. It might be a type of drill or plow that the farmer uses on the land, so that way it doesn't like strip away the soil as much. It could be a number of different things. And so what Pennsylvania said is, okay, we're going to give farmers a tax credit that's worth anywhere between 50 to 75% of the costs. Now, they could, with this tax credit, they could still accept grants or other sorts of public sources of funding. They just could only apply the tax credit rate to the portion that was covered by private funds. They could, though, do a type of sponsorship portion. They could, like, they didn't just have to use their own money. They could have, and this was usually with a bank, they could sort of leverage some money from a bank and say the bank gave them a loan or a farmer a loan to put this BMP on their project. The bank could then get the tax credit. So there is this sort of sponsorship mechanism going on with this program as well. And some other program specifics to note: it is a non-refundable tax credit. However, this tax credit could be sold, assigned, or transferred. And the annual program cap when we reviewed it was $10 million. And then in the most recent year of data we had, which was this report was done in 2021, it was raised to $13 million in 2019. And you'll see a little bit of that in the data, so I'll go over that. So based on this general walkthrough of the program, we came up with some goals and a purpose. So our goals were as follows. You had encourage private investment in the implementation of best management practices. We felt just because you could only apply the credit rate to the private money portion, as a way to leverage private funds in these projects. The second was to reduce the financial burden on farmers because of that private sponsorship where the farmer could essentially use this tax credit as a way to get financial assistance from banks and other entities, that it was a way to help the smaller farmers who may not have this capital to do these projects. Also to increase voluntary compliance with these environmental and agricultural management laws. A lot of these BMPs are indeed required by Pennsylvania state law. And so you can think of this credit as a carrot in the stick analogy, where instead of penalizing or punishing farmers for not having these BMPs, we're just going to give them a way to become compliant on their own. And why are we doing all three of these things? Well, we're ultimately trying to reduce water pollution and improve water quality. And the three main water pollutants are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So we're trying to reduce those in the water system. So now that we know what we're measuring and where we're going with this report and how to measure it, let's look at some data. So this is the latest 5 years that we had when we reviewed it. Again, we were published in 2021, so we were working on this through 2020. Wonderful year. But as you can see with the number of projects, these are going down over time. Now, we do see a bump here in 2019, and that's shaded over here because that's when the cap increased. So that's why you see a little bit of a bump there. But we generally expect the projects to go down over time because these are large scale, like buildings and like construction projects. So once you apply the tax credit for 1 year, you're not going to apply again the next year if your project's already complete. And so total project costs in 2019, $25.4 million. And then this REAP eligible now, if you're looking down here, that's 20.3 that I'm circling. To figure that part out is you take the total amount of project costs and you subtract this portion of the other public funds. So that's this $4 million here in 2019. So that's the other public funds, that's the amount that's covered by a grant. And so if you subtract it from the total project cost, this REAP eligible amount, that's the amount that the tax credit is applied to. So as you can see with the other public funds, that ranges about 15 to 20% of the total cost of the project. And then your credits issued here are $10.7 million in 2019, and that's about 40% of the cost. So that's how much the tax credit is like covering in terms of the total project cost. Our average credit award then in 2019 is about $25,000. And then, of course, this private investment portion down here is $10.7 million in 2019. That could either be the farmer's own money that they put in, or it could also be like a sponsorship where a bank would have the money. So now that we have this nice data, how do we use this data to measure those goals and whether it's accomplishing its legislative intent? Well, for that, we brought in some U.S. Department of Agriculture data. So we pulled all the farms in Pennsylvania and we looked at their tax entity status because that's publicly available on the USDA site. And we found that almost 90% of the farms in Pennsylvania are sole proprietorships, another 7% being partnerships. And so this is roughly 95% of all farms in Pennsylvania are relatively small. They only have corporation farms at about 5%. Just to note, this other portion is of like co-ops or other like volunteer farms. So we didn't want to include those in our look of them because they might not be subject to tax. And so for our purposes, we're kind of more on the tax side of things. So that would suggest that there's mostly small farms in Pennsylvania. And so what we wanted to do then is compare that with what the REAP applicants look like. So here we have our REAP awards by entity type, and you can see actually we have almost 60% of them are individuals, meaning they're not even listed as like a business entity. They would still be subject to personal income tax, but they're not going to be necessarily even listed here. So your pass-throughs then, they include anything from sole proprietorships, partnerships, LLCs, your S corporations. They're also subject to in our Pennsylvania, we have personal income tax. So they're combined with these two, it's about 95%. Now, one category you don't have here that you have here is the banks, and that's due to that private sponsorship portion I was talking about. The interesting thing about the banks, though, is they had the highest average credit award. So if you saw on the previous slide, I had the average credit award for 2019 for the whole program was $25,000. The average credit award to banks was $68,000. So they had the highest amount. And what this showed us was that the banks were really being used for these larger capital projects in order to help fund those. And so it was interesting to see that in the data. So what this would suggest, looking at these two graphs here, or figures here, is that we seem to be targeting the right applicants. We're not seeing an overwhelming amount of corporations here in the REAP, and so we're effectively making sure that we're targeting the right people for this program. And so we're sort of targeting that second goal of reducing the financial burden. Now, for the outcome portion, or the amount of water pollution we want to reduce, we actually were able to look at our state comparison for this, and we found that Pennsylvania and 5 other states in our area are part of this Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. Now, this agreement is run by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so EPA, and the EPA basically, what they do is they set what's known as a total maximum daily load for the 3 main pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And total maximum daily load is a bit of an interesting term, but the way you can kind of think about it is essentially EPA does some environmental modeling, and they have these very like complex, systems. And they basically, doing that modeling, they say, okay, Pennsylvania, you're currently emitting level 200, let's say, of nitrogen. So level 200 nitrogen, that's what you're at. And that's what's being emitted in the water for the Chesapeake Bay. So what we want to do is by 2025, Pennsylvania, we want to see that level 200 of nitrogen to go down to level 50. So when we run this model again in 2025, it should fall to level 50. And so that's basically what's going on, is that there's like a way to measure the pollution at like a large scale level, and the EPA is doing that. So each state has their own load goals, and in order to reach these load goals, they need to develop what are known as watershed implementation plans. And then these plans are approved by the EPA. Basically, the plans essentially say, okay, I understand my goal for 2025 is level 50. Here's what I'm going to do. So various states have various ways they can accomplish that, and the EPA signs off on it. So I read all of those plans, and I found that Pennsylvania and Virginia are the only states who utilize tax credits for this purpose. Most other states tended to rely on grants, loans, or other like technical assistance programs, tend to be a bit more direct in their approach of reducing their load goals, or I'm sorry, meeting their load goals, I should say. So knowing this, and knowing that they have this nice environmental model I could look at, I was interested then to see how Pennsylvania was doing compared to these other states. So what we have here is the data on that. This is the percent reduced from 2009 when they started tracking it to 2019, which is the latest year of historical data I had at the time. And you can see Pennsylvania here is relatively middle of the pack. We're reducing our pollution levels over time, which is a good direction to be. So we're making progress there. But however, on this other category here, where the reduction needed still for 2025, and so this is the amount that's still needed to reach that load goal. So that means a value of 0 means the goal is reached. So that means West Virginia down here is doing awesome. But unfortunately, Pennsylvania appears to be last in line here. As you can see, with all the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the sediment, we still have the furthest to go out of all the states. And so what this would suggest is that although we're hitting that financial burden aspect of this program and meeting that, it's not necessarily making a huge difference in terms of meeting our load goals and reducing water pollution. So we were able to make some recommendations from that. Mainly, we recommended that the agency that was administering this tax credit collaborate with our Department of Environmental Protection on doing some environmental modeling. And mainly, this was to help evaluate the impact of this program and sort of measure that water quality for each BMP that was put in. And it would also allow, and we hoped in the future, to possibly award credits based on objective data. Our research, when we did a literature review, indicated that having a prescriptive approach to these BMPs is a lot more cost effective, mainly because a lot of times if there's sort of outside factors that can affect the amount of pollution reduced. For example, if the farm is close to a body of water and you put a BMP on that land, well, that's going to reduce the pollution a lot more than if you put it on some other piece of land. And so related to that, we recommended that they convert the tax credit to a competitive grant program to sort of help to target those operations. But also we found that over 55% of the credits were sold. And that was because the farmers lacked necessary tax liability to utilize these credits. And so they were selling them for an average of 85 cents on the dollar. And this 15 cents was going to a third party sales facilitator that wasn't really part of this dynamic at all. And so on top of this inefficiency, a lot of the farmers we spoke to in our evaluation process were saying that they've had to wait almost a year, to even receive that sales transaction money to really benefit actually from the program, which is a long time to wait, especially if you don't have a lot of money and you're trying to, cobble together funding for your projects. So hopefully this presentation has kind of helped to show some ways you can measure the effectiveness of tax incentives without resorting to the return on investment metric and sort of measuring the economic and better going with the goals of not economic and anyway, sorry. We found when we've looked at these tax credits, agencies tend to limit the focus on applicants and the dollars exchange. But when we talk to recipients, they tend to view the programs as more than just the tax credit dollars they receive. They talk about, in this case, the amount of the better for the environment, how better for the environment these BMPs are. If it's a business, they talk about how the way they've managed to revitalize a community and bring people together. They sort of express all these things. And so my final point here is to having these conversations with stakeholders is absolutely necessary. For one, it gives you a chance to look at what it's like to participate in these programs. Oftentimes we're looking at these programs as sort of line items in a budget, and we don't really get to appreciate that some person has to go through, apply, and get to this program. And so through these conversations, we've been able to highlight policy design issues, inefficiencies, and other administrative burden. And also get some really good ideas for ways these credits could be improved. And so that is the end of my presentation here. I'm happy to take any questions. This presentation is posted on our website, but it might be back in October when I initially gave this one. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, for those of you who aren't here, if you have any questions, just use the hand raise function, and I should be able to allow you to turn your mic on. Feel free to also put any questions in the chat if you can. Yep, there you go. right. Not seeing any hands. If I'm missing you, throw something in the chat. Otherwise, we can move right along. Oh, there we go. Yeah, is each tax credit evaluated annually?
So yeah, it's a 5-year schedule, and each tax, so we have like a set number of tax credits we review each year, but we eventually over the 5 years review all of them. So no, not each tax credit is reviewed annually, but we over the 5 years we do reach every single one. Absolutely.
Yeah, what was the result of conducting this analysis? I guess. Maybe just in broad strokes.
Yeah, I guess just the recommendations that we came up with, would that be? Or you mean the like whether, because we had a legislative hearing on it and oh, I see. Yeah, I mean the legislative board definitely, I think they had agreed that they wanted more of the, so let me go back real quick because I want to have like the screen here to talk on. There we go. Yeah, so we had mainly recommended that they track performance of the water quality and sort of like how to track the way it was going down, since they had the ability to do that. And so the legislative board was definitely like that was something they were interested in seeing with this program. A lot of times when we're making recommendations, sometimes it's just that the agency isn't maybe tracking something that they should, and so the board was like, that's definitely something we would like to see, in this credit for the future. And then also the administering agency, the agency that was administering this program, they met and we had a little bit of a back and forth after this publication was out on what ways they could measure the pollution reduction over time. So I would say that part of it was perhaps like the successful portion of it. Sometimes that's for this particular report, but yeah, it does certainly. Yeah, so that definitely sounds promising. But yeah, so we've had sometimes mixed results with these recommendations, but I'd say for this particular one, they're looking forward to tracking the performance of it.
Well, any other questions? We don't have any. It's about time for us to move on. Alrighty. Oh, yeah, might as well. If we want to take just a minute here, hear about factors you think are conducive to having recommendations acted upon.
Yeah, I mean that's fine. I mean we can. What is it? What's the question? I'm sorry, I can't really see.
What other factor or what factors do you think are conducive to having the recommendations from reports like this be acted upon?
Oh, I mean, sometimes it's a bit, sometimes we really can't predict it, to be honest. But generally, at least with our legislative, it's a performance-based budgeting board. And so in addition to tax credits, we do performance-based budgeting, which just talks about doing like sort of, we're trying to analyze the impact of funds for agencies. So for example, if like it's a human services program, you put X amount of money towards this human services program, what sort of outcomes were achieved from that. And so this board is very much interested in like tracking the performance of various in this case, the tax credits. And so over time, we want to look at how these programs are, and eventually like figure out if are they necessary, are they necessary, and are they doing what they're supposed to be doing, or do some legislative changes need to happen? Because sometimes they, like when a legislator puts out a program, they don't necessarily know how it's doing unless well, someone like us comes and says, hey, you know, there's some issues here.
Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. I think we will move now to our second speaker, Dr. Jeff Allen. He's the data visualization lead at the University of Toronto School of Cities. He is a cartographer and urban data scientist and specializes in creating interactive maps and visual essays. He'll take us through a few of his more recent projects and showcase some of the technology used to create them. So thank you so much, Jeff, for showing us your work, and please take it away.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for the intro and having me come speak today. So I'm based in Toronto, so I'm also on the 2:30 time here. So let me try to share my screen and get started. Just, can you guys see the screen there? Just want to.
Nothing's coming through for me.
Oh.
But that might be just me. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I can see the Firefox window.
Yeah, so I won't introduce myself too much more on that, I think, other than I'll say that my original training was in engineering, and then did kind of a shift more into the geography, cartography, visualization world, like 5-6 years ago when I was going into grad school. And yeah, so I currently work now as the lead of data viz at the School of Cities. I have one slide, which I think is very kind of, maybe this is a bit ridiculous, but I'll go back to it. It's just basically contact information. I'll share it back at the end. So I think I'll briefly introduce the School of Cities, since most of you probably aren't aware of it. We're a smallish institute at the University of Toronto, in Toronto. And we're not like a traditional university department that offers degree programs. We're more of like a smaller group, about 9-10 full-time staff, as well as a number of like student researchers and affiliated faculty and researchers and such. And we're at the university a hub for kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research, teaching, and community engagement. So we hold events, we offer kind of one-off courses, and organize research grants specifically designed to bring students and researchers from different departments, which are often very, at least maybe this is a Canadian university context, I don't know as much in the States, but they're often very siloed traditionally. So we're trying to bring people who are doing lots of interesting research and teaching on cities and urban subjects to work together on projects, whether this is in a classroom setting or more of a traditional research kind of project. And we're also increasingly doing a lot of work trying to make a lot of the great research that's going on at our university more accessible to a wider audience, so not just to academics, so not just writing journal papers, which are great, but to make research more accessible to folks like planners, policymakers, nonprofits, and then more broadly the general public. So we're trying to do this through mediums like videos and documentaries, blog posts. We do hold like public art exhibitions, write like shorter, more digestible policy briefs, and then on my side doing like maps and data visualizations, which I'll show a few of today. And these are generally focused on exploring or telling a story around a specific data set or research topic or policy issue. And they're also made to be as publicly accessible as possible. So something just sits on a web page for people to go and explore. You don't need a technical background to view these maps at all. You don't need to download software data or anything like that. Most of these are focused in Toronto or sometimes other Canadian cities, because that's where we're based. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Toronto. I mean, it's probably most of you know where it is, though. It's on the shores of Lake Ontario in the Great Lakes area of Canada. And then, historically, for thousands of years, it was the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. It was settled more permanently by the British in the late 18th century. I mean, similar history to a lot of the other Great Lakes cities, like probably like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, and so on, Rochester, and had kind of this history of being a trading outpost and then going through industrialization. But unlike a lot of these other Great Lakes cities, particularly in the United States, Toronto has like grown a lot, particularly over the past 20, 30 years. So now it's the city itself, the population is about 3 million people. The metro population is 8 million, and I think if you compared it to U.S. cities, that's probably just after I think it'd be the 4th largest metro area after New York, LA, and Chicago. But I'd have to double check those numbers. But yeah, and a lot of the recent growth has been due to immigration. It's very diverse. I mean, under some metrics like linguistic diversity and country of origin, it's some people have ranked Toronto as the most diverse in the world, and continues to grow a lot. And then in Toronto, we often see headlines like this, that we have more cranes than a lot of other, and this headline more than most U.S. cities combined. So there's this website that tracks cranes as a measure of urban development. And if, like, most people looking out their windows, a lot of people in downtown Toronto live in apartment buildings, and they look at the window to see a sea of cranes and buildings under construction, which is quite amazing at this time. And so I'll jump over to actually a few of the projects that we've been creating to kind of like look at urban growth and change in Toronto and Canadian cities. So this was one map that we made probably last fall, where we were simply trying to track where population growth and decline was occurring in different Canadian cities. And this is zoomed in Toronto. So this was made to be, just sits on a web page using some open source mapping technology. And you can land on the page, you can view, you can zoom in and out. And the key data that it's showing is population growth between 1996 and 2021. So blue circles, and the larger the circle means there's more population that has moved into that area, most usually due to more dwellings and apartment buildings being built, while the red areas are actually areas where the population has declined. So despite, I'm kind of just saying all this population growth in Toronto, it's really concentrated in some areas, which is what we found through this kind of mapping project. A lot of growth in the downtown center. These are kind of like, it's kind of a polycentric development in some areas, like lots of towers in these areas, particularly downtown Toronto. And then there's a lot of urban sprawl along the fringes. But the interesting thing as well is that a lot of these older neighborhoods have actually lost population, despite them, gentrifying and becoming more expensive. The map also kind of allows you just to kind of click on a zone. It tells you some basic stats about the zone difference over time. It's a relatively simple tool, but we've used it a lot for teaching as well, about neighborhood change in different Canadian cities. It also allows you to zoom and look to different other Canadian cities too. So closer to most of Yellow, I guess, is Vancouver, which is mostly grown over this time, doesn't have the same neighborhoods of decline as some other cities like Toronto or Calgary is another one that has this ring of decline around a center of growth and growth in the suburbs. So this is one type of kind of map that we're making, where it's basically you land on the page, you can explore the data yourself. There's no real narrative to it. It's kind of a self-exploratory tool in that sense. We're also building more blog posts or stories or essays built around maps and data. So these tend to have different names, like a story map or a visual essay. Some news outlets do similar work as well, of course. So this is one where we're looking at kind of wealth inequalities and poverty concentration in Toronto, based off of recent Canadian census data. So it's an exploratory view at looking at what are kind of the income inequalities within the city. That's what this map shows here. So blue areas in Toronto are wealthier, red areas are poorer. There's a few different metrics we can kind of click through and see: household income, individual income, and also a poverty rate as well. Where is poverty concentrated within the city? So there's a few other maps that kind of look at this. I'll show this one briefly because it's an interesting story, I think, where we're basically plotting the same map, household income by year, but doing this in these kind of small little, seven different small maps every 10 years. It shows the story of how kind of this geography of income inequality has changed throughout the city over time. So back in the 1960s, the red areas were the poor areas of cities concentrated in downtown Toronto, wealthier neighborhoods, in more suburban areas. But this has kind of slowly shifted over time to a lot of the suburban areas in 2020 being the lower income areas, while wealth more concentrated in the center, and then downtown, the central areas. Kind of it's very mixed, very diverse in terms of income in that sense. This was another kind of visual essay or story map focusing on zoning in Canadian cities, and particularly how difficult it is to build a more eclectic mix of housing in a lot of neighborhoods. So Toronto, other Canadian cities, in a lot of neighborhoods, you can only build single detached residential homes, which don't allow for a lot of other mix of housing types, and arguably wouldn't lead to have as much supply of other kind of housing that people need. So we were trying to map particularly where these were in cities. So this is Calgary, mostly this yellow single detached zone, and then other residential and mixed use zones are in kind of green and a little bit in blue, although there's not as much mixed use zoning or housing in Calgary. Edmonton is kind of a different kind of story, where they've allowed for a lot of mixed use housing in a lot of their residential neighborhoods. And then here's Toronto, like the other map. So it's a lot of Toronto is zoned solely for this one type of housing. So in the yellow zones, we can't build apartments or duplexes or triplexes. There is some zoning changes that are being brought into them, but it's still very one-dimensional type of housing in these neighborhoods. I'll show what else do I have here? Oh yeah, so this is a different topic completely. We were looking at parking tickets in Toronto. The C is kind of a proxy for kind of where people were competing for parking spaces, partly just as where is kind of enforcement going on, but where is also kind of a lot of urban activity happening within the city. Because in one sense, we can think if there's a lot of parking tickets in an area, there's a lot of people who are trying to visit that area, but it's also probably an enforcement thing as well, or lack thereof, as in other neighborhoods, as well as whatever restrictions are in the neighborhood. So this was a project where we're trying to add like millions and millions of rows of data and then linked it to street segments like this to plot it onto a map. And it makes this really interesting pattern of clusters of activity within this is the downtown part of Toronto, and then a little bit in other high density neighborhoods as well. And as a side, like this is up here is a university, and over here is a university. So it's university students also competing for parking spots next to where their universities are. What else do I have? So we've done a couple projects working with trying to plan out new infrastructure. So this was a case where there's proposed so greenway networks or trail networks, bike networks within parks within a section of Toronto called Scarborough. And the planners we were working with, planners and researchers we were working with had kind of plotted out just in a GIS where there's current routes and where they were proposing new routes. And this was a very quick way to take their proposal. So the proposed routes are the dashed lines, and the existing are the solid lines, and put it onto a map that could be easily shared with basically anybody just through kind of a URL, and you can click and zoom and look at where these routes are proposed relative to a lot of the current streets and cycling networks in the area. And some of the links on the side go to more detailed designs of each one of these routes. So this was a case where this was probably only like a day's worth of work to put this map together, but it proved to be very useful in terms of taking an existing research project, which was just a big PDF document, and putting it on something that people can more interactively explore with. I'll show this one as well, even though I know most of you aren't super obviously familiar with Toronto, but this was a case where we're looking at urban history in Toronto, particularly how the city has changed over time. This is might be a little bit slow to load because it needs Wi-Fi to do it. And obviously being on a Teams call at the same time. So this is showing historical satellite or aerial imagery on one side, and then kind of what it looks like today, or like well, at least in 2021, so very close to today on the right side. And so with this, we can kind of zoom into a neighborhood and then drag this little thing across to show how the city has changed over time. And you can see a lot. Just for reference, like this building is the City Hall in Toronto now, and then back in the 30s, it was more of a residential neighborhood. There's a few different kind of time periods we have to pick from, so we can track how some things have been built over time. So up in this area, I think, is where there's a highway that was being carved through Toronto back in the 60s. In the 40s, it wasn't there. There's a lot of farmland and residential areas, but it was kind of that 1960s big highway planning phase in Toronto and a lot of other North American cities. But you can see that the highway just stops here, and this was a case where like people were really fed up with it going through their neighborhood and bringing a lot of pollution and traffic to the neighborhood. And eventually, there was a large enough public opposition to the highway, and they stopped building it further into the downtown of the city, which was nice. But it did get this far, and it's still very interesting to see kind of the before and after of these types of neighborhoods. And I'll show one other project that it's completely in development. And I talked a little bit about the diversity of Toronto, and this is a map where we're trying to actually map that, particularly in terms of spoken languages. So there are over, I think, 150, at least 150 languages spoken in Toronto, by at least, I think, probably 100 people or so. And we're trying to map that out and compare where people speak these languages based off of their home locations, based off of the census. So we have the landing right now is just 3 languages. We have Mandarin, Italian, Punjabi, which clearly cluster in different parts of the city, but also there's a lot of speakers of all of them downtown. And so this is set up that we can kind of like, search for a language. For example, if I want to look at Portuguese, you can see where the Portuguese speakers are. If I want to look for, I'm looking at Persian now, we can see that there's, a lot of speakers in this neighborhood. So there's about over 100 or so language to choose and select from, and we can kind of map and compare where a lot of these speakers are. So this is kind of an ongoing project, but hopefully something we'll be publishing in the next week or so. So yeah, I think that's probably a few, and I see there's about 10 minutes left, so I think I'll stop there. My contact info and the School of Cities contact info is here, so feel free to like screenshot or take any of this, but or at least if you want to screenshot my email, I'm happy to chat. Like if you had any questions about anything that I showed, I'm happy to follow up by email anytime. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I have one quick question before we bring up some of the other ones from chat. So I've worked with some geographic data before, and stuff like the language map, for example. I know with stuff like census data usually only goes down to census tract or census block level. How do you get such like fine-grained data that you're able to plot it down to like the unique block or like even street address maybe?
Yeah, so I think for the language one, we're actually doing the Canadian census data goes down to what are called like dissemination areas, which are probably equivalent to US block groups. So it's like 3 or 4. And so for that map, it's basically each one of those dots is being kind of randomly generated within one of those block groups. And then so it's not an exact representation of where those language speakers are. And I think that's also probably a privacy concern as well. Like most of that data will be. So that map was more to look at like the regional or at least neighborhood kind of patterns rather than exactly where these speakers are. But some data like that parking ticket data, we had that at like an address level. So, so it really depends on what the data source are.
Mm-hmm. I imagine for the ticket one, that was just like a collaboration with the police, or is that a public data set?
Yeah, it was public data set. So it's just through the city's open data portal that we were able to map.
Nice. Very cool. All right. So we have a question. Essentially, plotting one dimension in a map is nice to look at, and from my own experience, nice to like gauge where it might, warrant further investigation, but doesn't do a great job showing correlation or causation. So have you developed anything kind of looking at things in more 2 or more dimensions like that?
Yeah, 100%. Most of these examples I showed were built like, kind of a one-dimensional story for sure. But done a lot of bivariate mapping, particularly where have 2 variables and then highlighting kind of the high, low kind of clusters between them. I'll see if I can show an example of that quickly. If you just give me 1 sec, I'll show an example. So this was a project where we were looking at transit accessibility. So how good is transit in a neighborhood? And that was measured by like how many employment opportunities you could reach by transit, and comparing that to where recent immigrants live in the Toronto area. And so the goal was was part of a larger project to see looking at kind of the travel behavior and also kind of the travel barriers for recent immigrants in Toronto, because recent immigrants were less likely to own a car, partly because of income constraints, but also because it takes a while to get a driver's license as well, and would be arguably more reliant on public transit. So we were trying to map out where immigrants were settling the city that had poor transit access, and then how could this then feed policy to improve transit service in those neighborhoods. And you can see this is the classic bivariate map legend here. This is just a static map. It's not interactive, but so I can't just like switch this right now, but because it's a screenshot thing. But yeah, so this is an example of that kind of map. Yeah, and crime, and I just see your comment, and crime and income would be another kind of example as well that I've seen mapped in this sense.
Do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any. It does look like I missed one for Michaela. Just dealing with your office, what political protections the Independent Fiscal Office has to do that kind of nonpartisan work?
So just maybe I'm not understanding the political protections part. Like, I mean, that's what our office is created to do, like independent like analyses. And well, we started doing like revenues, and then over time we've gotten more responsibilities added to us. But Act 48, like, specifies that we need to, we're typically, our projects are run by statute. And so like Act 48 prescribes that we need, when we're doing like performance-based budgeting, for example, can't make policy recommendations, have to stick with like performance. But it was just unusual for Act 48 where we had to for the tax credits. And that's why I mentioned like that's something that was quite unique for our work. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Hopefully. If not, yeah, feel free to ask follow-up. But a question for Jeff, do you offer training through School of Cities? You're muted, I think.
Okay, I'm muted. Okay, my God. Yeah, we do, yes. So we're increasingly planning to hold kind of like smaller workshops around kind of mapping data science kind of topics. And the other thing I was going to share now that came up is that might be applicable, or at least something you can share for to other folks. It's more aimed at smaller or smaller mid-sized towns, but offering kind of data and resource training focused around like particularly issues about equity and justice in cities. So that's the link for that. That's kind of like an affiliate grant project that we're funding. So if you're interested in something specific, feel free to email me and ask. Like, we also sometimes just like even internally do hold like a workshop on something, but then we'll take any of the material we use for that workshop and make it publicly available online, and just like a blog post or tutorial or that kind of thing that you can work through any of the data and tools and things. They're all kind of open source, for example.
Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we're running pretty low on time. So I think we can wrap it up. but thank you once again to both of our presenters. Really appreciate you guys making the time to come talk to us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.